everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Alec and I are delighted to be with you today, virtually tour together Jewish Egypt. As you can probably hear, and Gila said, I'm originally from London, but I made Aliyah 18 years ago, and now I live in Modi'in with my family. So over the course of the next hour, we're going to be doing some time travel. And for the first stop, I want to take you back about 100 years. These are pictures from my family album. They're great-grandparents, grandparents, great-aunts and uncles, my dad, his brother, and many cousins. And they're all taken in Egypt, where my family lived for about 3 generations. Those years from 1890 to 1956, the Suez crisis, were really considered this golden age for Jews in Egypt. And it was always a place that was very romanticized for me growing up. Spoken about with a lot of love and a lot of nostalgia, which is ironic given their traumatic departure 67 years ago. But for me, maybe it's that jarring of personal memory and historical fact that really intrigued me. Eventually, I moved to the Middle East myself, and I've become fascinated by this period, a period that was very tolerant, open, that really mixed Oriental traditions and Western culture, where Jews and their Muslim neighbours lived harmoniously side by side, and where extended multi-generational families lived a seemingly safe, joyous existence in many different languages. And as Gila said, I was very lucky, and I went back with my dad in 2018, and I realised that we have this very small window where people who still remember, like Alec, from the former community can share their stories. And in March, that really inspired me to take back another group. And in March 2023, I took a group of 24 people, some who were born there, some who'd never been back, some who wanted closure, children, grandchildren. And today we're going to kind of go through some of the highlights of that trip, and I'm going to share the sites that really still remain there. So we're going to do some time travel first and just look at the history. So the first sign of Jewish presence in Egypt is really from about 600 BCE, because there's no archaeological proof that the Jews were there in the biblical times, but they did find remains of a Jewish temple from about 600 BCE, close to modern-day Aswan. And about 300 years later, Alexander comes and conquers Egypt, and his successors really encouraged Jews to settle there. The Jews there, they work as farmers, as tradesmen, politicians, police, but they're not granted full citizenship. And unsurprisingly, they become increasingly Hellenized. And the Bible is first translated into Greek in Egypt, and it was that version that was read out in the synagogues. Very interestingly, there's actually proof of a replica temple, and not the second temple, but a copy of the first that was built in Egypt at this time by a group of refugees from Judah near modern-day Heliopolis. And that building actually lasted for over 200 years before being destroyed by the Greeks. And then we're going to jump forward to 70 CE and the destruction of the Second Temple. The Romans come into power. They bring some of their Jewish captives to Egypt. And at this point, the situation gets much worse for the Jews. There are pogroms, brutality, anti-Semitic laws. But we're going to make our first stop right now to the Ben Ezra Synagogue, which is located in what is today known as Fostat, or Old Cairo, and is in the oldest part of the city. It's regarded as one of the oldest synagogues in the world. There's a bit of debate about whether it was built in the 1st or the 9th century, but either way, there's a couple of interesting things to note. So there are 2 reading platforms, or bimas. Most synagogues only have one, and and one of them actually has a marble stone on it that reads, a legend of the inhabitants say that Moses prayed in this place. And some, in fact, believe that Batia, Pharaoh's daughter, found Moses at this place on the Nile. What we know is that it was customary for Egyptian Jews to maybe spend the whole night on the 2nd floor of this building. It was called the Eliahu Hanavi room, and people used to go there and pray for a refuah shalema, for restored health for themselves or for family members. And you might have heard of this synagogue because actually it was here that in the 19th century, about 400,000 fragments of Jewish, Arabic, North African manuscripts that date from the 6th to the 19th century were discovered. The largest collection in the world. They became known as the Cairo Geniza. And these have now been rehoused in university collections all over the world, the largest part actually in Cambridge University.
Sorry, Louise, I'm just stopping you for a second. Are you meant to have been sharing your presentation? Because it hasn't been shared.
Ah, yes, I have been. Oh, I'm sorry, you've missed out on some lovely pictures. Hang on. Thank you for, I got to it so excited. So, all right, well, let me just show you back. These were the pictures that I was referring to earlier on of my family, of my dad's side of the family, my great-grandparents, uncles, aunts, great-uncles and aunts, my dad, his brother. These were photos actually from my grandmother and my great-grandmother in London. And this was the synagogue that we were talking about. So we're back. Thank you, Gila, for noticing that. Because I've got two screens here, sorry. And this is the Ben Ezra Synagogue. And so the Ben Ezra Synagogue, as I said, the second floor, which is this famous Eliahu Hanavi room where people used to go and pray there and sleep there overnight. And the two bimmers in the synagogue. And as the community grew, they requested to the Sultan for more land and to extend their cemetery out of Fustat. And in 1482, the Mamluk Al-Ashraf Ketbi, he agrees and he writes a declaration as such that he grants them this extra land. So this land became known as Bassatine Cemetery, and it's really a testament to the community that once was. It's really one of the oldest Jewish cemeteries in the world, and at its peak, it's sprawled across 363 acres of land. Unfortunately, after the Jews left in the late 1950s to the 2000s, it became filled with squatters and garbage and rubble. And as you can see, the cemetery was plundered and most of the marble tops stolen. So what remains on most of the graves is really only an impression of the original engraving into the clay. Sadly, most of the communal records have been sequestered by the government, and it's really impossible to identify most of the graves. Large parts of the cemetery have been built over, and at one point, the government even had plans to build a road over it, but that thankfully was halted due to Jewish community efforts who brought in rabbis to identify Jewish grave sites and protect this as a holy site. The Egyptian government actually, in line with Islamic principles which respect the dead, they responded and they changed this route of the ring road that now kind of goes around and straddles part of the cemetery. From about 2019, I think, to 2020, thanks to collaborative efforts from the Americans, the Drop of Milk Association, which we'll talk about later, and the Karaite Jews of America, this cemetery was actually renovated, and I'll show you, it was partially brought back to life. So this was actually from my trip, some of the 27 acres that are now divided into 5 smaller sites. And some of the private cemeteries were for the richest families, including one for Rav Chaim Kapusi, who was a 17th century spiritual figure. And until recently, his site really was still a pilgrimage site for many North African Jews. So, as I said, part of the cemeteries were restored, including the Karaite section, which was totally reconstructed with flooring. There's a mausoleum, there's a small museum, and it was rededicated as a garden of remembrance. So by about 640 CE, Arabs have taken over Egypt. and things take an upward turn for the Jews. Jews have come in from Mesopotamia, from Syria, Palestine. They're trading more freely. And we know that things get better because two great Jewish scholars come out of Egypt at this time. Rabbi Saadia Gaon, who's actually born in Egypt. He's this prodigal student, and he's called out to Babylon to continue his studies there. And the other person is Moses ben Maimon, who is known as the Rambam. And he's born in Spain, but he flees Spain and comes to Egypt. He is a Torah scholar, a philosopher, an astronomer. He becomes the physician to the Saladin, who's the head of Egypt at that time. And he becomes this prominent figure in Islam and for the Jews. And I'm going to show you his synagogue. So he actually had his medical rooms and a yeshiva in the heart of the old Jewish quarter, the Hat al Yahud. He dies here, and he's eventually his body's actually taken and reburied in Tiberias. But interestingly, this synagogue was renovated in 2010 by the Egyptian government. And again, 10 years later, recently when I was most there, it was also closed for renovations. And unfortunately, this is really the only remnant of Jewish life left in the old Jewish quarter in Cairo. So by 1250, the Mamluks conquer Egypt. They're not kind to the Jews, but then by 1517, the Ottoman Empire takes control, and they positively welcome those Jews who are in Spain and Portugal following the Inquisition in 1490. Napoleon, he comes in at about 1800, and he's only there for 3 years, but his presence really has a lasting impression and draws the attention of Europe towards Egypt. He brings scientists and explorers, and they begin to bring Egypt much closer to the West. So, as I spoke about before, the Hat al Yahud, this is the place that I was referring to. It's the old Jewish quarter of Cairo, still has the same name today. And it's a very small neighborhood with very narrow lanes, with homes, shops, synagogues. And it wasn't a ghetto like in Europe. Jews were not forced to live there. Jews chose to live there. It was a protected neighborhood that allowed them to live a very traditional communal life. And at this point, you have a melting pot of several different Jews in Egypt. You have the indigenous Egyptian Jews who've been living there for about 2,500 years. You have the Spagnoli who fled from Spain and Portugal in the 15th century. You have Italian Jews who came as early as the 18th century. And these groups are kind of homogenous, and they group together in terms of their culture and practice. And they're known as the Sephardi Jews. Separately within the same Jewish quarter, in the Karaite, you also have the Karaite community. They're a different sect, and I'll talk about them as well. You also have an Ashkenazi quarter, which as late as the 1940s really resembled an Eastern European shtetl. And in fact, Egypt was the only Middle Eastern community that had an active Ashkenazi community, synagogue, and leadership. As I said, sadly, there's really nothing left there today, and it's just the Rambam Synagogue. By 1805, the Ottomans regain control, and Muhammad Ali Pasha, he is really seen as the founder of modern Egypt. He spreads tolerance, liberalism all over Egypt, and he sees Egypt open to all citizens of all religions. He reorganizes the country, reorders it. He abolishes discrimination, repealing taxes that had been previously applied to Jews and non-Muslims. And under his rule, many new synagogues are built, and there's this economic boom. Interestingly, and I always like sharing this fact with Americans, one of his major policies was to revive agriculture. Which really pays off massively in 1861 with the US Civil War, because at that point there's a shortage of worldwide cotton, and the price of Egyptian cotton quadruples, which really brings this huge economic boom to the country. And in 1863, his grandson takes power, and he shares this ambitious outlook of his grandfather, and he continues this program of modernization, most significantly with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. And this brings massive international interest and investment into Egypt, largely from France and Britain. And this construction of the canal is such a monumental world event that Verdi was commissioned to write the opera Aida for the opening of the ceremony of the Suez Canal. They didn't quite jive in time, but that was the idea. So for the next stop, I'm gonna just take you briefly to a Karaite synagogue, which still exists and was refurbished recently. For those of you who aren't familiar with Karaite Jews, they're a sect of Jews who not only believe in the written law, the 5 books of Moses, they only believe in the in the 5 books of Moses, and they don't hold to the oral law, to the Talmud. The Karaite community in Egypt was considered one of the strongest and oldest in the world, and they lived really in their own community with separate religious and communal bodies than rabbinic Jews. And my grandmother always said that they weren't really considered Jewish in the same way as traditional Jews, and they kind of lived separately. They didn't marry, they didn't intermarry, they had their own synagogues. You can see actually from the photographs that the synagogue really resembles much more closely to a mosque. You have the boxes for shoes in the hallway before you go into the main synagogue. There are no chairs. Everybody sits on the floor. The mezuzahs also are different. You can see they're only the 10 Commandments. But it's very interesting. And the Karaite community in America, which includes some very prominent and wealthy members, have really invested in restoring and ensuring the preservation of their synagogue and their history in Egypt. Another synagogue that still stands really in downtown Cairo is the Eitz Chaim Synagogue. It was dedicated in 1900, and you can see that even though this building stands in disrepair, as soon as you enter the sanctuary, you can recognize the beauty and importance that once was. Beside the sanctuary, there's also a sukkah that still stands. There's a yeshiva building, a mikveh, and there were rooms for the caretaker. And you can see inside the Aron HaKodesh some of the Torah scrolls that are still there. They're all wrapped up in plastic. And Alec's going to talk about some of the work that was done to try and see if we could bring these religious relics back. The Egyptian Antiquities Ministry has become very strict, and Alec will tell you more about that, but that this is all that's still there. And you can even see the stone with all the names of the families who were involved in founding the synagogue, the names that still exist in Jewish communities today. Batish, Pinto, Nacamuli. There's a Nacamuli there I can see as well, Alec. Ashkenazi, yeah. Levi. So it's, these are really interesting artifacts about and historical records. And the main synagogue in Cairo, which in case any of you have been, you may have passed, which is on a main street, on a main boulevard, was the Shar HaShamayim, or the Gates of Heaven. This was built in 1899 with a style that evokes an ancient Egyptian temple. You can see the ancient fans on the building. And this was the largest building on the wide downtown boulevard once upon a time. It was paid for by the Jewish banker Nassim Mosseri and designed by an Egyptian Jewish architect called Morris Katawi. And it was considered one of the most beautiful and impressive buildings in Egypt. Nowadays, it's only open for services on High Holy Days, which are really attended by diplomats or visitors. But it's still there, and it's very beautiful. And before I hand over to Alec, I'm going to just do one last stop, just to kind of give you a flavour. This is Alexandria, which looks very similar to the promenade in Tel Aviv. And my grandmother always used to say that being in Tel Aviv reminded her a bit of her hometown of Alexandria. You can see life in Alexandria was good. It was very different to Cairo. It was a seaside town. Many Cairo families used to come to Alexandria for the summer. It was a holiday town, big community, with better weather and a legendary social scene, so I'm told. In Alexandria, to Cairo, there was a totally different religious council. They were split by Cairo and Alexandria. There wasn't one overall umbrella. And Alec is going to share with you about the Eliahu Hanavi Synagogue, which was refurbished. But I'll also show you, these are some of the buildings that used to belong to Jewish families that are now taken over by government buildings or schools. And this is the Stanley Bay beach houses, which were very central kind of to the summer social scene. And you may have read about them in books or seen it in movies. And I wanted to, this is the area one of the synagogues that Alex will talk about. And the cemeteries, you can see the difference. These are the cemeteries in Alexandria compared to in Cairo. They've been much better kept up. And although the records have been sequestered also in Alexandria, Alec and a few other people have been trying to go round and take notes and help people to find their family grave sites. You can see here we managed to find family members on our recent trip. So I want to, at this point, I'm going to hand over to Alec, but before I do, I just thought a map is a useful point just to see this melting pot of Jewry, of Egyptian Jewry at this time. So you have post-Inquisition immigration from Spain and Portugal. During World War I, actually, 11,000 Jewish refugees, mostly Ashkenazi, who were expelled from Palestine by the Turks, come to Egypt. The situation in Syria isn't great either at this point, especially with the opening of the Suez Canal, because the Silk Road through Damascus becomes much less important. So you have Syrian Jews coming in. After the Turkish Revolution in 1922, immigration comes in. You have immigrants from Salonika in Turkey, where my family came from. During World War II, there are also persecuted Eastern Europeans that are welcomed to Egypt. And really, Egypt becomes this very prosperous, cosmopolitan community in the Middle East. There's lots of new economic opportunities, access to the best education, entertainment, and a lot is really driven by the influence of Britain and France. So life is good, and life is good for the Jews. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Alec, who is going to, take it from here on.
Over to you, Alec.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay, thank you, Louise. So we are now at the turn of the 20th century. The Jewish population is around 60,000. And as Louise has just showed you, it's a community largely based on immigration. And it was also the most prosperous Jewish community in the Middle East. And at that time, Egypt was a model of tolerance and mutual respect. People of different nationalities and religions mixing and working together. Greeks, Armenians, Italians, Levantines, etc. And in spite of the fact that Egypt was more under the British sphere of influence, French was the lingua franca. When a Greek met an Armenian, they would speak in French. I'll give you perhaps one extreme example of how communities mix together. I'm sure you know who Rudolf Hess was, the German war criminal. He was actually born in Alexandria in around 1890, because at that time, the Hess family, based in Egypt, was a very respected German family and ran the largest import-export firm. And my grandfather, before he founded his own business, worked for the Hess family. And once he was invited to tea by the Hess, and supreme honor given little Rudolph to bounce on his knees. And he always used to say, if I'd known, I would have thrown him on the floor. Jews were actually very active in political life. Early on in the 1890s, there was a character, Victor Sanua, known as Abu Nadara, because he used to wear glasses, spectacles. He campaigned in his newspaper against the British presence and for Egyptian independence under the motto L'Égypte aux Égyptiens, Egypt to the Egyptians. You had major Jewish families, Felix Ben-Zaken, Victor Sonsino, David Hazan, who were active members of the Waft Party, which was the party led by Saad Zaghloul Pasha calling for independence. It was a Jew, Leon de Castro, who was the itinerant ambassador of the Waft, so traveling to France, to Italy, to the United States, pleading the case of Egyptian independence. And then, of course, in 1917, we had the Balfour Declaration, and the Zionist Federation of Egypt was created. And you find the same characters, Ben-Zaken, Sonsino, Katawi, at the head of the Zionist Federation, which today would appear like a contradiction if you are at the same time working for Egyptian independence and for the Zionist Federation. But of course, in those days, what both wanted was getting rid of the British. Egypt became independent in 1922 under King Fuad, so a great-great-great-grandson of Muhammad Ali, who Louise talked about. Joseph Katawi Pasha was appointed as finance minister. The chief rabbi of Cairo, Haim Nahum Effendi, was a senator, and he wrote most of the king's speeches. The president of the Alexandria community, Joseph de Picciotto, was also a senator. The Queen Nazli had Jewish ladies in waiting, like Madame Katawi, and it was also, of course, rumored that the king had Jewish mistresses. And what is important is that the king would make a point of attending the Colony Dray service on the eve of Yom Kippur to mark his sort of solidarity with his Jewish subjects. And then at the other extreme of the political spectrum, we have Hillel Schwartz, Henri Curiel, and Jacques Rosenthal, who were founding members of the Egyptian Communist Party. I must say that in those days, it was more what I call an ideology Communist Party, as opposed to really integrating with trade unions and workers and the proletariat. Jews also contributed to, very importantly, totally sort of out of scale with their actual presence in economic life. Joseph Katawi Pasha was, as I told you, the first finance minister. Salvatore Sicurel, Victor Harari Pasha were on the board of the National Bank and founders of the Misra Bank, the most important commercial bank. Then you had private commercial banks which are opened by Jewish families, Mosseri, Suarez, Rollo, Zilka, de Menache. One of my cousins was president of the Cotton Exchange in Alexandria, and both the Cotton Exchange and the Stock Exchange would close on Jewish holidays. You also had Jews active in agriculture and food processing, flour mills, pasta, food, sugarcane, a very prosperous middle class of professional lawyers, journalists, and medicine. And in particularly, the Jewish families dominated the retail sector. The major department stores, Anno, Sicurel, Salon Vert, Ben Sion, were Jewish. And actually, those names still sort of remain. I was in Aswan in 2001, and there was a large queue outside a shop still called Ben Sion. And I asked what was that about, and I was told, well, it's the first day of the sales. And here you have a photo of the main Sicurel department store in Cairo, so the sort of Bergman Dorfman or Harrods of Cairo. And this is today a photo which Louise graciously sent me of the main department store in Alexandria, Anneau. Jews were also active in urban development. So at the turn of the 20th century, the whole of the south of Alexandria was a marsh, was a swamp. And it was a Joseph Smuha, who was actually born in Baghdad, but he moved to Manchester and then to Egypt. And he actually undertook to drain the swamps and build a garden city modeled on the British garden cities like Welwyn Garden cities. You got some examples of the villas there, slightly sort of Bauhaus style. And then in Cairo, the public transport, the tram and bus lines were founded by a Jewish family, the Suarez family. And in fact, in Arabic, people wouldn't say Nirkab el-Tram, I'm going to ride the tram. They would say Nirkab el-Suarez. The name Suarez became synonymous for trams. And then, of course, most importantly, Jews were active in culture, sports, and the arts. Murad Farag Lisha from the Karaite community was a prominent poet, philosopher, and grammarian. James Saradel Sanua pioneered modern colloquial Egyptian theater. He was known as the Egyptian Molière. In sports, Salvatore Sicurel, the leader of the family of the department store, he was captain of the fencing team at the 1928 Amsterdam Olympics, where they gained a silver medal. And Jews, particularly from the Maccabi club, would play in the national basketball teams. And then in the arts, you had lots of dancers, Sarina, singers Zaki Murad, Dawood Hosni, real name David Levy, who were Jewish. The Egyptian cinema was very active. Egyptian cinema is like the Hollywood of English language cinema. And one of the reasons, incidentally, you know that there are various different dialects in Arabic. North African Arabic, Algerian, Moroccan is not the same when spoken as Egyptian Arabic or Palestinian Arabic or Syrian Arabic. The one which is most universally understood is Egyptian Arabic because of the cinema, which would produce 200 films a year. And there were two moguls. One was Talat Pasha, an Egyptian Muslim, but in particular Togo Mizrahi, who was from an Italian Jewish family. And he was one, particularly the founding father of Egyptian cinema, and launched the Alexandria studio. And then you had several Jewish actresses and actor, Rakia Ibrahim, real name Rachel Levy, Camelia, real name Lilian Cohen, Shalom, who was one of the major comic actors, and then, of course, the famous Leila Murad. She was the daughter of a cantor, a Hazan, at the Cairo, in Cairo, and she was a singer and a dancer. And what I'm going to show you here is one of her films. In fact, she was so famous that in 1952, she was the one who actually was appointed to sing the Song of the Revolution, as opposed to the famous Kalsum. So let me show you here one of, sorry. There she is. This is Layla the Flower Girl. Who's going to buy flowers from me? And I hope you notice that no woman has got her head covered. So that was Leila Murad. So a few words now about Jewish life and the Jewish community then. So as Louise told you in terms of religious, you had the Rabbanites, Sephardi, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazi, and the Karaites. If I'm looking at it from a sort of social strata point of view, the Jewish community, which peaked at about 85,000 after World War II, largely immigrants. So on the one upper layer, you had sort of the aristocrats, the large landowners, rich bankers and industrialists, also involved in politics. You had a prosperous middle class, business and professional middle class. But then you also had an impoverished class, mainly indigenous Egyptian Jews, concentrating around the Hat el-Yahud and close to poverty and assisted through charity. Foreigners were protected by a system of capitulations. These were bilateral treaties between the Ottoman Empire and other countries, whereby they were subject to the law of their respective countries. And if they were sort of incriminated, they would be judged by what were known as mixed tribunals, les tribunaux mixtes. So a British citizen would be tried by a British court, a French citizen by a French court, etc., etc. French, as I said, was the lingua franca, and it was an extremely nice life. Spacious villas or apartments, servants, social and sporting clubs, the beach in Alexandria, and every year visits by French theater groups like the Comédie Française and Italian operas. As Louise hinted, the Cairo and Alexandria synagogue communities operated independently. There was no overarching body such as the Board of Deputies, but there were 18 synagogues in Cairo and 12 in Alexandria, and some of the rich families maintained private oratorios. Each community ran their charities, so Old People's Home, orphanages, hospitals, and even actually there was a charity to provide dowries to young girls from impoverished families. And there were a lot of Jewish schools. The Agion, the Katawi, the de Menache families had founded school. My grandfather, before he became honorary president of the Cairo Jewish community, was in fact responsible for the Jewish schools. They were particularly oriented not so much from a religious point of view, but the whole idea was to give a modern education, to teach them modern languages, English, French, Italian, and of course mathematics, so that they would have a better chance of professional life, and also perhaps looking ahead, if they had to leave the country, they would be able to integrate easier when they got into United States or England or France. Although, however, the comfortable families sent their kids to French or English schools, I went to the Lycée Français. You also had the famous Victoria College. The indigenous Jews were much more religiously observant. The immigrant Jews were not necessarily very strict. One of the famous rabbis in Alexandria, Rabbi Prato, who came from Florence, wrote in 1927, "I am surrounded by a community going to pot from a spiritual point of view. Few strictly kosher immigrant homes. My family, for instance, we do not eat pork, but we enjoyed shellfish. And after Shabbat service, there was no kiddush in the synagogue, but everybody walked down the road to meet at the Brazilian coffee store. And of course, as you know, we eat rice at Pesach, and the synagogue baked their own matzahs, and they would bake very, very fine matzahs, which we could use like phyllo pastry for borekas. If you're looking at life cycle events, in terms of bar mitzvah, what was more important than the bar mitzvah on the Saturday was laying tefillin for the first time on the Thursday before the Saturday. And actually, when you talked about somebody, you would say, my Sammy, he's going to lay tefillin. On va mettre les tefillin. You wouldn't say he's going to have his bar mitzvah. And hang on, let me get back to... And here for girls, there would be a batai, a communal ceremony every year organized by the Cairo and the Alexandria Synagogue. Anyway, this idyllic life was beginning to sort of wane in the light of the winds of change. So in 1936, King Farouk was crowned, and you had the rise of anti-Semitism, particularly since the birth of the Muslim Brotherhood. There were also youth movements like the Misr al-Fatat, sort of nationalistic movements who would parade up and down in green shirts, and you can guess where they got their inspiration from. Farouk, during World War II, Farouk and some officers were pro-Nazi. There's actually a telegram that was found in the German archives from Farouk to Hitler, where he actually says, "Me and my people are united in wishing for German victory to liberate us from British yoke." There was also a group of officers who were actually passing information to the Germans on the position of British troops. And a group of them was arrested in July 1942, so 3 months before El Alamein. And would you believe who was one of those officers? None other than Anwar el-Sadat. And anyway, we all know that, thank goodness, victory at El Alamein. And I was actually born exactly 9 months after El Alamein, so I'll let you guess what caused that. Then the war is ended, life comes back to normal, but however, there used to be regular riots on the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. The Cairo Jewish quarter was attacked, the Ashkenazi synagogue was destroyed, but the Egyptian government paid for its rebuilding. In 1947-49, we had the introduction of nationality laws. So all the companies needed to employ 75% of Egyptian staff and 51% of paid up Egyptian capital. And that's when a lot of Jews took up Egyptian nationality, and we'll see how that backfired against them. And then, as I said, demonstrations against establishment in 1948-49, the Israeli War of Independence. Jewish population then 20,000 left between 1948 and 1950. In 1949, those mixed courts were abolished. And then in 1952, there was an incident on the Suez Canal where the Egyptian army killed 40 Egyptian the British Army killed 40 Egyptian police, and that created riots in Cairo, is known as the burning of Cairo, and attacks against the Jewish businesses. This photo here shows you what was left of the Sicurel department store, which I showed you a few minutes ago after those riots. But even then, the whole, let's say, country was seething. Because of the humiliation of the defeat during the Israeli War of Independence in 48-49, but particularly because of the dissolute life of King Farouk, who would spend most of his times in foreign casinos, gambling and womanizing. And that's when in 1952, we have the free officers who seize power, who topple the king. Farouk is sent in exile. And here, you remember how I told you that the king would attend the Colony Dre service. Here in September 1952, you have General Naguib, who was the leader of that group, who made a point of attending Colony Dre to try and reassure the Jewish population that everything would sort of continue as usual. And to a certain extent, yes, it did sort of reassure wrongly a lot of people. I remember my father would mutter from 1952 onwards, "Ce pays n'est plus pour nous." This country is no longer for us. But my mother preferred to remain anyway. And it's a bit like German Jews or Austrian Jews during, at the rise of Nazis. Then, of course, in 1956, we have the Suez Crisis, the nationalization of the Suez Canal by Nasser, who had taken over, who had sidetracked Naguib. And that was on the 23rd of July. And that, of course, triggered off the Second Arab-Israeli War, the Suez War. You had this agreement between France, England, and Israel, that Israel would attack, France and England would intervene to separate, retain control of the canal. But that actually misfired because the Americans intervened and they positioned, this was the year when Eisenhower was seeking re-election. Don't remember that at the same time we had the Hungarian uprising and the Russian invasion of Budapest. And the Americans said, well, we can't on the one hand oppose regime change in Budapest and condone it in Egypt. And the Americans positioned the Seventh Fleet ships between the French and the British ships and the Egyptian coastline, saying that if you're firing on Egypt, you are firing on us. So to a certain extent, perhaps a military victory, but a stinging political defeat. And that's where we had massive arrests of Jews, sequestration of assets, and expulsions. And so between 1956 and 1957, 30,000 Jews were expelled or left, all their assets confiscated. My family, I left with my family on the 15th of December, 1956, a day which my father would always celebrate as Pesach Sheni. By the time of the Six-Day War in 1967, there was 3,000 Jews left. They were imprisoned, sent to hard labor camp, tortured. Because I don't know who's on the audience, I will spare you some of the details. And by the time of the Yom Kippur War, we were down to 1,000 Jews who gradually left or died away. And today, from a community which, as I told you, at its peak numbered 85,000, there are something like 7 Jews left between Cairo and Alexandria. So what's left in there? Louise has already given you an overview of some of the synagogues and cemeteries in Cairo and Alexandria. I'm going to continue. Sorry. So there are still some Sifrei Torah. So these are the Sifrei Torah which are still in Alexandria. There's about 70 of them. If you're going to ask me about why don't we take them out, we have a problem. Louise hinted at it, the Egyptian law on antiquities. You cannot take out of Egypt anything that is older than 100 years. And at one point, we sent a sofer to Egypt to look at them. And regrettably, very few of them are still sort of would be worth restoring. Most of them now, remember, they will probably not have been unrolled since 1960, are pasul. Then this, Louise showed you a photo of the Eliahu Hanavi Synagogue in Alexandria. And at one point, about 8 or 10 years ago, the roof over the ladies' gallery collapsed. With the group I'm involved with in terms of preserving the heritage there in situ, we approached the Ministry of Antiquities, offered to raise funds amongst the Egyptian Jewish diaspora, but to their full credit, the Ministry of Antiquities said, yes, no, we will do it ourselves. And they actually spent $4 million restoring the synagogue, which, if you remember what I told you a few minutes ago, amounts to about $1 million per Jew left today in Alexandria. And here you have a photo of the restored synagogue. There was a sort of inauguration that the Egyptian government organized, but it was a purely what I call civilian. It could have been opening a telephone exchange. Nobody wore a kippah. There was no religious service. No representatives from abroad were invited. So with a group of friends, we organized a return trip. And we got 180 Jews from Egypt with their families to go back to Egypt and rededicate the synagogue, Hanukat Habayit, and conduct Friday night and Saturday services. So here you see the interior of the synagogue. I mean, I know I'm biased, but I still believe it's the most beautiful synagogue I've ever visited. It's in Italian style. It was built in about 1850 and then rebuilt in 1935, as you can see it today. What is interesting is that when they were doing the restoration work, they also found underneath remains of an older synagogue from the 12th of the 13th century. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a few video extracts of this trip to Egypt, where we visited the cemeteries and then conducted the service. So if you...
Adon Olam.
Sorry.
שוכן במרומים
So you see the Alexandria Synagogue, cemetery.
כנפי השכינה במעלות הקדושים וטהורים כזוהר רקיע מאירים ומזהירים את נשמת מנחם בן לוסי אבואף, ארמון אבואף, יצחק בן אפרים עקר, בן ציון אלקבס, אברהם אלקבס, אנג' כהן, שלמה בן יהודה פדידה, רפאל יעקב גלנטי, יצחק בן עמנואל נקמולי, גבריאלה נקמולי, וגם רובר רולו.
And now the ceremony inside the synagogue. So where we bought Sefer Torah under a talet and replaced them in the ark. You can see what a beautiful synagogue it is, all in marble with the Ner Kandil.
Mashiach ben David.
Sorry.
That's okay. Is that the end?
Yeah, I'm trying to get back.
Ah, okay.
Sorry. Right, yeah. Thank you. So that certainly was one of the most moving episodes of my life. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alec. Thank you for sharing. And Louise, do you have more to add, or are we over to questions? We can't hear you. You're muted. Okay, I'm trying to do that.
There I am. No, that's fine.
I guess some people were really interested in why the government is got such a role in restoring the synagogues versus the Jewish communities themselves, and what is the politics around that, and who is now upkeeping the Jewish sites? Is it the communities or the government?
Well, I think one of the things is that's a way of currying favor with the United States, which, as you know, are the main financial backers of the Egyptian government. Are they trying to, perhaps like we have in Eastern Europe and Germany, create a resurgence of Jewish tourism? Unfortunately, this reinauguration of the synagogue took place on the 14th of February 2020, so 2 weeks before COVID. So, of course, nothing happened for 2 or 3 years. And then Louise organized the trip she talked about. But of course, since then, we've had October the 7th. And I mean, there were plans of using it as a museum or whatever. But what's going to happen, Louise? What do you think?
So one of the President Sisi's actually named Judaism as one of the 3 religions of Egypt, if you can believe that. And there's definitely been a move by the government to sort of reclaim Jewish history as part of Egyptian history, like they see it as part of their story to tell. There was this there was a kind of the Egyptian government, I think, were nervous about allowing too much of the kind of Jewish diaspora to kind of come in and fundraise and rebuild themselves, because they didn't want to take out antiquities, because obviously, as you've been to the British Museum, you'll know why they were nervous about that. And so I think as a way of making sure everything stayed in Egypt, they said that we're going to deal with it. We'll be in charge of restoration. We'll be in charge of the records. That's why part of the reason they've sequestered the records. And I think also about, people making claims against the government, I think that also protects them if there are no records to be found. There's an association, an organization, if we're talking about who's involved today, called the Drop of Milk Association, and Gut Delir, which is a welfare organization from many years ago, that has taken on itself to kind of now to preserve the synagogues, to hold events. The remaining Jews, the leaders of the community, who were children of Jews who kind of stayed, who supported the nationalist Egyptian regime, who are now involved in that organization. And there's also been a bit of a resurgence among Egyptians who have traced back Jewish ancestry, so they're now involved. And there's, we talked about the renovation of a number of synagogues. There was another Geniza actually found in Cairo, and under the approval of the Egyptian government, they actually brought in a professor from Israel to go through that Geniza and to do an inventory of what was there. So, but obviously October 7th has kind of scuppered plans. But I have to say that my group, we were very warmly welcomed both in Cairo, both in Alexandria, and we were talking about doing another trip. So who knows, maybe we'll be able to pick up that idea at some point in the future.
Louise, Alex shared with us that the rededication of the Eliahu Synagogue was very emotional for him. Was there a particular moment on your trip with your dad and or with another participant that was particularly moving when you were retracing the steps of where people had grown up and left on their exodus?
So there was a lady on my trip whose mother was actually a friend of my grandmother's, and I'd never met her, and we kind of made the connection. And she took us back to her apartment building in downtown Cairo. It was this beautiful building. We went at night after on our way to dinner. It was dark. This building was derelict, but you could still see this beautiful iron staircase in the entranceway. And we walked up the stairs, and I mean, there were kind of wires and garbage. And she took us to the front door of her old apartment building, and she read a poem about being a child and having to leave your childhood friends and your childhood home. And she read it with a light of a telephone, of a mobile phone, outside the front door. And it was so moving. It was really a full circle moment for her, being able to be back there and see her childhood home. And I think I actually have a video of it. Maybe I can send it to you, Gila, and you can send it around.
Thank you. Alec, do you know what was your experience, and do you know a lot about if there was any relationship with the Christian communities that were in Egypt, as they were also a minority?
Well, yes, my father's, the family business, we had Egyptian Christians who were part of it in the family business, so that we would also have a certain number of Egyptian managers and employees. Yeah, I mean, as I said, everybody would mingle and trade and socialize.
Very interesting.
I mean, if I remember and I look back at my parents' friends, they were Greeks, they were Italians, Greek Orthodox, Italian Catholics, Lebanese Christians, Egyptians, Muslims.
So that cosmopolitan era was not only like golden age for Jews.
It's not only Lawrence Durrell and the Alexandria Quartet, no.
Okay, thank you. The last question is just back to the, I think it was it the Ben Ezra Synagogue at the very beginning, Louise? Did you say there were 2 bimot there?
Yeah, there are 2, which makes it unusual. And one of them is actually engraved. I'll try and bring back the photograph.
And why is that?
I'm not sure why it is. It's a very old synagogue, and I'm not sure why that there are 2 bimot there, to be honest.
Something we can look up for our follow-up email.
Yeah.
Well, we've gone over time.
1 minute, there's hello, there's somebody who's put their hand up. Evelyn Benzikri.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we've gone actually 10 minutes over time. So thank you so much for this very inspiring and interesting trip to Egypt. And I know that there are turbulent times at the moment, but we really hope that we'll be able to go with you on a tour and discover these places which are so close to both of your hearts. And it just adds another picture to the mosaic that is the Jewish people. So thank you, Alec, and thank you, Louise.
And thank you, Gila, for hosting us.